All right, so let's look at the rest of the options that we have in the PSSDiag tool. Now, first of all, let me check general performance again. I'm going to start by looking at the tabs we've got here. So by default, the tool will gather an X events trace. You can turn this off if you want. It will gather up to 500 megabytes of trace information in a file, and it will gather up to 50 files. Once it finishes the first file, once it fills that up, it'll start rolling over into other files, and it will number each of those files. It'll do essentially the same thing for profiler traces if you want. If you're not familiar with X events, I can understand you wanting to use profiler trace instead. This is what the tool did primarily when I started using it. I've spent a lot of time looking at profiler traces, I will tell you that. I would encourage you though, even if you're not terribly familiar with X events, they've come a long way since they were first introduced. And when they were first introduced, there were not as many X events, or there were not as many X event types as there were profiler traces, so you legitimately could do less with X events. But that is no longer the case. I think as of SQL 2012, there were a superset of events in X events compared to profiler traces. But again, as I mentioned in the last video, X events was engineered to be more performant, to be more efficient, to not have as big an impact, as big a footprint as a tool as profiler traces. So I would really encourage you to use X events whenever possible, especially if you're on a busy system or a performance system, a production system, and you don't want to affect negatively the performance of the system. Now, this tool also gathers perfmon by default, and it'll gather up to 250 megabytes. I believe the files still roll over in a similar way to the X events trace. There's a lot of configuration options here. You can pick basically anything under the sun that's at the Windows level, along with many options within SQL Server itself. The great thing about this is that you're probably not going to have to change anything here. Out of the box, this is perfectly fine vast majority of the time. We gather information on some .NET memory, we gather some objects under IP, under logical disk, under memory. We gather all of the SQL Server groups by default. We gather network activity, we gather some information under objects, physical disk, which is definitely relevant to what we're doing, all processes on the system, processor information, processor performance. I've had very few occasions that I've needed to add anything more than this. The only thing I can really think of off the top of my head, and this was more relevant when people were still using x86 systems, is I had to add a paging file a number of times when there were actually memory issues where we were spilling over into the paging file. That's about it. And I haven't done that in years, obviously. So out of the box, perfmon, this is giving us a lot of information. We can see very easily from this if part of our problem is we're overwhelming the CPU of the system itself. If the CPUs are pegged at 100%, guess what? That may be an easy way to confirm what you're seeing in other places regarding, say, weight types within SQL Server. Also, memory issues and physical disk issues, they happen all the time. I've seen a lot of issues that were storage related that relate to SQL Server. So having all this information is a great pickup. Custom diagnostics. There are a number of things in here that you may turn on occasion that you're not going to want the vast majority of the time. There are some things that are included by default. MS Info will give us some basic information about the system. How much physical RAM do we have? How many CPUs do we have? How many cores? That sort of thing. Information on Query Store is nice to see. I'm a big fan of what they have done with Query Store, so it'll be interesting to see what that exposes. Now there's a lot of information under here. So we've got all of the error logs gathered by default. We've got some additional information from PSSDiag. We've got power plan, so this will tell us if, say, our production SQL Server is set in, a power saving mode as opposed to be in high performance mode. That can have a big impact. How many profiler traces are we running on the system? One of the things you'll see, especially if profiler traces are actually affecting the performance of the system, you may find that you've got some monitoring tools, or maybe a developer is running a profiler trace you weren't expecting. The more of them that you have on your system, the more likely they are to affect performance. If they are running remotely, if it's a client-side trace, these can have a much larger impact. and we want to be aware of that and avoid that whenever possible. So there's several good things here. I love the information that's brought out by perfstats. So what this will do is this will, and we'll gather some snapshots at the beginning and at the start and at the end of the PSSDiag capture. But there's an ongoing capture that'll gather information about weight types, about blocking, and this perfstats information is really, really valuable. So all of this stuff is good by default. As we change what kind of trace we are gathering, we may see different custom diagnostics included. We also have things here about in-memory OLTP, linked server, server broker that you may find that you want to turn on specific occasions, memory errors. If you're using some of the, say, less common options in SQL Server like full-text search or database mirroring, these things may be very useful to you, so it's good to know that they are there. So we also have some other scenarios, so let's look through them real quick. We've got the replay option is take the activity, essentially save the activity by tracing it, and then replay the activity later on another server using I believe, OStress. So this is, I think, configured to give you exactly the events you need to do that sort of trace. It can be an interesting way to benchmark one system compared to another, or test out, say, whether a newer version of SQL Server, a different CU, performs better or worse. You could capture an hour worth of activity from server 1 and play that activity on server 2 and see how long it takes to go through that. Memory and grant issues. It's not gathering many X event traces if we turn that on. We're gathering memory grant usage and not much else. Let's see what this gathers in terms of custom diagnostics. Several of the basic things, but also including SQL memory error, which is not on by default when we're doing, say, a general performance trace. We have a scenario specifically for always on. This doesn't capture any X events, but it does turn on several of our custom diagnostics. Let's see, under my custom diagnostic collector, there's probably a custom thing specifically for always on that's listed under there. Azure Virtual Machine, yeah, there's a separate group under custom diagnostics for Azure VM. Column Store, there's a separate group under custom diagnostics for that, probably also not capture any X events. In-memory OLTP has another group under custom diagnostics. We also have events for StretchDB and Polybase. So let's look at the miscellaneous tab. Oh, very good. In addition to gathering perfmon, in addition to gathering all these other pieces from the custom diagnostics and gathering the X events, we'll gather the event logs by default. And its shutdown is typically when you'd want to see that. So whatever activity that happened while you were tracing, if it causes events to go into the system log or the application log, we'll be able to see that because we'll gather the event logs at shutdown after that activity. The SQL Diag DMVs are another thing that we will capture at shutdown. That can be very valuable. I wouldn't turn that off for any reason that I can think of. Right now, the package default output folder, I think this is just telling us where we're going to save to, but let's go to save this and see what this looks like. You can see I've actually got several traces actually saved out by default. So let me just say I want to do a general trace. I want to save this here as PSSDiag general, haha. Save that out. Couldn't be easier. All right, so we've got our package saved. Now the next thing would be to actually run the utility. We'll do that in the next video. I'll show how to start up the tool, shut it down, what the interface looks like when the tool itself is actually running.